The crystal wine glass hung suspended in midair, crimson liquid catching the restaurant's golden light. Thomas Sterling's lips were millimeters away from the rim when the scream shattered the evening silence. "Stop! It's a poison!" The homeless teenager burst through the mahogany doors like a thunderbolt, rain-soaked sneakers sliding across marble floors. Security guards lunged forward as the priceless glass exploded against Italian tile, wine spreading like blood across white stone. But in that split second, as chaos erupted and cameras flashed, Sterling caught something in the boy's eyes. Not madness. Knowledge. The kind of precise, scientific certainty that had built his pharmaceutical empire. The kid clutched a weathered notebook against his chest, his wrist bearing the faint tan line of an expensive watch long since pawned, and the way he analyzed that spilled wine, crouching to examine its color with laboratory precision. How did a street kid know what trained bodyguards missed? The answer would change both their worlds forever. 3 months earlier, Jamal Washington had been living a completely different life, but fate has a way of stripping everything away until only your truest self remains. The overpass stretched above him like a concrete sky, highway thunder drowning out the city's heartbeat. Here, in this forgotten corner of downtown, Jamal had built something extraordinary from nothing. Glass beakers salvaged from university dumpsters, burner flames powered by pocket-sized camping fuel. pH strips traded for tutoring sessions with grad students who never asked his real story. His makeshift laboratory wasn't much to look at. Plastic tarps kept the rain out. Battery-powered LED strips provided just enough light to read molecular structures. But every piece had been chosen with purpose, arranged with the precision of someone who understood that knowledge was power, and power required proper tools. "Hydrogen sulfide concentration is too high," Jamal muttered, testing water samples brought by other homeless individuals from various city sources. Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who'd lost her apartment to medical bills, watched anxiously as he worked. "This one's safe to drink, but avoid the fountain near 5th Street. Bacterial contamination." She pressed a crumpled dollar bill into his palm. "You saved my grandson from getting sick last week." Jamal shook his head, trying to hand it back. "Keep it. Knowledge should be free." But Mrs. Carter was already walking away, and his stomach betrayed him with a fierce growl. When had he last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time blurred when hunger became your constant companion. He pulled out his most treasured possession, a photograph tucked inside his waterproof notebook. 3 people in white lab coats, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. His father, Dr. Michael Washington. His mother, Dr. Sarah Washington. And between them, a younger Jamal wearing a junior scientist badge from the university's summer program. "Dad always said knowledge was the one thing no one could steal," he whispered to the photograph, the way other people might pray. The memory hit like it always did, sudden, sharp, unforgiving. The phone call at midnight, lab explosion, gas leak. His father, the brilliant chemist who'd taught him to see molecules like music, reduced to newspaper headlines about industrial accidents and safety violations. Everything unraveled after that. Legal battles over insurance claims, medical bills that devoured their savings as his mother battled depression and anxiety, the house sold, the cars repossessed, his college fund emptied to keep his mother in treatment at the facility upstate. Jamal's hands shook, not from the cold November air, but from the familiar rage that lived in his chest like a caged animal. 3 years. 3 years since he'd been Jamal Washington, honor student with a full scholarship to MIT. Now he was just another invisible face on the street, counting quarters for his next meal. But giving up wasn't in his DNA. Every morning, he'd wake before dawn to collect discarded equipment from the university's chemistry department. Broken beakers could be cleaned. Expired reagents still had useful properties. And the graduate students who saw him digging through dumpsters? Most looked away. But a few, The ones who recognized intelligence regardless of circumstances would slip him textbooks, outdated but still valuable. "Your methodology is fascinating," Professor Kim had said last month, examining Jamal's handwritten analysis of local water quality. "Have you considered formal education?" If only she knew. Jamal had smiled politely, taking the compliment without revealing that he'd been accepted to MIT's chemistry program. Before life imploded. The acceptance letter was still in his notebook next to his family photo. A reminder of dreams deferred, not abandoned. Winter was coming. Already morning frost turned his breath to clouds, and the concrete beneath his sleeping bag felt like ice. Other homeless individuals talked about heading south, but Jamal couldn't leave. Not when his mother was only 200 miles away, counting on him to visit when he could scrape together bus fare. Not when he was so close to breakthrough. Because Jamal had a theory. A dangerous, impossible theory about why his father really died. It started with inconsistencies in the accident report. Gas concentrations that didn't match the equipment specifications. Safety protocols that his father, a man obsessed with precision, would never have ignored. And then there were the research notes, pages and pages of his father's work on pharmaceutical compounds that had mysteriously vanished from the lab after the explosion. Someone had killed his father. Jamal was sure of it, and someday, when he had the resources and credibility to investigate properly, he'd prove it. Until then, he survived. One day, one chemical analysis, one act of service at a time. Because Dr. Michael Washington hadn't raised a quitter, he'd raised a scientist. And scientists never stopped asking questions. The scholarship application deadline was next month. Jamal had been working on it by streetlight, crafting essays that explained his situation without sounding like he was begging for pity. His grades were 3 years old, but his knowledge had only grown. Self-taught chemistry, real-world application. Letters of recommendation from graduate students who'd witnessed his work firsthand. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe someone would see past his circumstances to the mind underneath. Maybe, but first, he had to survive the winter, and that meant finding better shelter, steady food, and enough stability to complete his application. What Jamal didn't know was that destiny was already moving. That Tuesday evening, everything would change in ways he couldn't imagine. But that Tuesday evening, Jamal would witness something that made his blood run cold. The thunderstorm hit downtown like a sledgehammer, turning the November air into sheets of ice-cold rain. Jamal huddled under the narrow awning of a closed bookstore, watching water cascade down the restaurant district's gleaming windows. Inside La Bernardin, the city's most exclusive dining establishment, warm light spilled across white tablecloths and crystal stemware. He shouldn't be here. This neighborhood was for people who belonged, people with credit cards and reservations and lives that made sense. But the storm had caught him during his evening rounds, and every doorway for 6 blocks was either locked or guarded. Through the rain-streaked glass, Jamal watched a man dining alone at a corner table, distinguished, silver-haired, the kind of person who commanded attention without trying. Even from outside, Jamal could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened during what appeared to be a heated phone conversation. Thomas Sterling, though Jamal didn't know the name yet, pressed the phone closer to his ear, his free hand gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. "You can try your hostile takeover," Sterling's voice carried faintly through the glass. "But I'll burn the company down before I let you profit from Michael's research." Michael. Something about that name sent a chill down Jamal's spine that had nothing to do with the cold rain. The conversation ended abruptly. Sterling slammed the phone down, then sat back in his chair, suddenly looking at every one of his 63 years. The weight of whatever battle he was fighting seemed to settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. That's when the waiter approached. Jamal had been people-watching long enough to read body language like a textbook. The waiter moved wrong. Too careful, too deliberate. His hands trembled slightly as he carried a bottle of wine that clearly hadn't come from the restaurant's cellar. No dust, no proper temperature conditioning, and the label was positioned to hide the vintage year. Everything about the moment screamed danger. The waiter's eyes darted toward the kitchen, then the exit, as he approached Sterling's table. Classic nervous behavior. Jamal had seen it in his chemistry lab back when students tried to hide mistakes from professors. Fear mixed with guilt, creating a cocktail of tells that trained observers couldn't miss. And then the wind shifted. Through the restaurant's ventilation system, carried on the storm's gusts, came a scent that made Jamal's scientific training scream warnings. Bitter almonds. Faint but unmistakable to someone who'd spent years studying organic chemistry. Potassium cyanide. His father had taught him about it during one of their weekend lab sessions. Smell is the first line of defense, son. Your nose can detect concentrations that instruments might miss. But if you ever smell bitter almonds where they shouldn't be... The waiter was now beside Sterling's table, presenting the bottle with theatrical flourish. Sterling nodded absently, still absorbed in his phone troubles, as wine poured into crystal that caught the restaurant's amber light like liquid fire. Jamal's heart hammered against his ribs. From this distance, he couldn't be certain. Maybe it was a cleaning chemical from the kitchen. Maybe his paranoid mind was creating patterns where none existed. Maybe... But Sterling was lifting the glass. Time crystallized. Every chemistry lesson his father had ever taught him crashed together in a moment of absolute clarity. The concentration of bitter almond scent, the waiter's nervous behavior, the wine's slightly off color spoke of foreign additives. Someone was trying to kill that man. Jamal's internal war lasted maybe 3 seconds. Getting involved meant exposure, meant police questions he couldn't answer without revealing his identity, meant losing the careful anonymity that kept him safe on the streets. But his father's voice echoed across 3 years of grief. With knowledge comes responsibility, son. If you can help someone, you help them. Period. The glass was inches from Sterling's lips. Thunder crashed overhead as Jamal made his choice. He sprinted toward the restaurant's entrance, rain turning the sidewalk into a skating rink under his worn sneakers. The maitre d' at the front desk looked up in alarm as this soaked, homeless teenager burst toward the door. "Sir, I'm sorry, but..." Jamal didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Sterling was already tilting the glass, wine approaching his mouth, while the waiter stepped back with the satisfaction of a job completed. "Stop!" Jamal's voice cut through the dining room's refined murmur like a fire alarm. "It's poison!" Every head turned. Conversations died. The crystal glass froze halfway to Sterling's lips, crimson wine trembling with the sudden stillness. For one heartbeat, the entire restaurant held its breath. Then chaos erupted, and nothing would ever be the same. What happened next would be captured by every security camera in the district. Security guards materialized from nowhere, moving toward Jamal like guided missiles. The maitre d' was already on his radio. "Code red, dining room, homeless individuals, possible mental health crisis." But Sterling, something in the teenager's voice made him pause. The glass remained frozen in his grip as his eyes locked onto Jamal's face. In that split second of connection, Sterling saw what the security cameras couldn't capture: absolute certainty, scientific precision, the look of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. "Wait." Sterling's command cut through the confusion. "Let him speak." The lead security guard hesitated. "Sir, this individual..." "I said wait." Jamal's chest heaved as he fought to catch his breath. Rain dripped from his hair onto the restaurant's pristine marble floor. Every eye in the room was on him. Wealthy diners, concerned staff, smartphones already recording what would become viral footage within hours. "The wine," Jamal gasped, pointing at the glass in Sterling's hand. "Don't drink it! Please!" "Son, what are you talking about?" Sterling's voice remained calm, but his grip on the glass had tightened. Jamal pulled his weathered notebook from inside his jacket, pages damp but protected by plastic sheeting. His hands shook as he flipped to a section filled with molecular diagrams and chemical formulas written in his father's precise handwriting. "Potassium cyanide," he said, the scientific words cutting through his exhaustion like a blade. "I can smell it from outside. Bitter almonds. It's faint, but it's there." The waiter took a step backward. "This is ridiculous. The wine came from our finest cellar." "No, it didn't." Jamal's voice gained strength as his training took over. "Real vintage wine would have sediment, temperature variance. This bottle is room temperature, no cellar dust, and the label's positioned to hide the year marking." He pointed at the waiter, whose face had gone pale. "And you're sweating despite the air conditioning. Classic stress response." Sterling studied the wine glass, then looked at the waiter. 20 years of running a pharmaceutical company had taught him to read people, and something in the waiter's expression triggered every alarm bell he had. "Call the police," Sterling said quietly. "Sir, really, this is unnecessary." The waiter was backing toward the kitchen now. "And test this wine." Sterling carefully set the glass on the table. "Full chemical analysis." The waiter bolted. He made it exactly 12 feet before the restaurant's security tackled him to the ground. The kitchen erupted in shouts as other staff members scattered, but the damage was done. The confession was written all over the waiter's face. Jamal collapsed into a nearby chair, adrenaline finally catching up with him. His notebook fell open, revealing pages of chemical equations, molecular structures, and analysis techniques that would have impressed university professors. Sterling approached slowly, like someone trying not to spook a wounded animal. "What's your name, son?" "Jamal. Jamal Washington." "How do you know about chemistry, Jamal?" The question hit deeper than Sterling intended. Jamal's eyes went distant, seeing not the restaurant's opulent decor, but a memory of a different lab, a different time. "My father taught me," he said simply. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Within minutes, the restaurant was crawling with officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians. The wine glass was carefully bagged for analysis. The waiter, whose real name turned out to be Marcus Flynn, a man with significant gambling debts, was read his rights while confessing to being paid $50,000 to ensure Thomas Sterling never left the restaurant alive. "Who paid you?" Detective Rodriguez asked during the preliminary questioning. Flynn's answer would send shockwaves through the pharmaceutical industry. "Richard Hawthorne. Said Sterling was about to ruin some business deal. Said it had to look natural." Sterling's face went white. Hawthorne. His former business partner turned bitter rival. The same man who'd been trying to acquire Sterling Pharmaceuticals through increasingly aggressive tactics. But that revelation was for later. In the immediate aftermath, as statements were taken and evidence cataloged, Sterling found himself watching Jamal with growing fascination. The kid wasn't just smart, he was brilliant. His explanation of the chemical analysis demonstrated graduate-level understanding. His observational skills rivaled trained investigators, and there was something about his methodology, his approach to problem-solving, that felt hauntingly familiar. "The lab results just came back," Detective Rodriguez announced. "Potassium cyanide, exactly as the young man identified. Concentration would have been fatal within minutes." A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Smartphones captured every moment as the story began spreading across social media. Homeless teen saves billionaire's life. But Jamal seemed oblivious to the attention. He sat quietly in this corner, clutching his notebook, looking more exhausted than triumphant. When a reporter tried to interview him, he simply shook his head and turned away. Sterling noticed. This wasn't someone seeking fame or reward. This was someone who'd risked everything, his safety, his anonymity, his freedom, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Jamal," Sterling called softly. The teenager looked up with eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. "Thank you. You saved my life." "Just glad you're safe, sir." The simplicity of the response, the genuine relief in Jamal's voice, told Sterling everything he needed to know about this remarkable young man's character. What Sterling didn't yet realize was that this chance encounter would unlock secrets that had been buried for 3 years. That the notebook in Jamal's hands contained more than just chemistry lessons. That the familiar methodology he'd recognized was more than coincidence. And that the man who'd tried to kill him tonight was the same man who'd destroyed the life of the most brilliant chemist Sterling had ever known. But those revelations lay ahead. For now, there was just a billionaire and a homeless teenager, connected by an act of courage that would change both their lives forever. The storm outside was finally breaking, but the real storm was just beginning. But as Sterling reached for his wallet, Jamal's response would reveal something extraordinary. The crime scene was winding down. Photographers had documented everything. Witnesses had given statements. The attempted assassin was on his way to county lockup, and Thomas Sterling was officially the luckiest man in the city. Now came the part everyone expected: the reward. Sterling pulled out his leather wallet, fingers moving automatically toward the thick stack of hundreds he always carried. In his world, problems were solved with money. Services were compensated. Life-saving interventions deserved substantial payment. "Jamal," he said, approaching the teenager who still sat quietly in the corner, looking utterly drained. "I can't begin to express my gratitude. Please let me—" "No, sir." Jamal held up his hand, not even looking at the money. "Just glad you're safe." Sterling paused, wallet still open. In 40 years of business, no one had ever refused his money, especially not someone who clearly needed it desperately. "Son, you saved my life. That has to be worth something." Jamal finally looked up, and Sterling was struck again by the intelligence in those dark eyes. But there was something else there, too, a kind of integrity that seemed almost old-fashioned in the modern world. "It's not about worth," Jamal said quietly. "You needed help. I had knowledge that could help. That's not a transaction, sir." "That's just being human." The simplicity of the statement hit Sterling like a physical blow. When was the last time someone had done something for him without expecting payment, without calculating angles or potential benefits? But Sterling was also an observant man. A successful businessman learned to notice details, and the details about Jamal Washington were adding up to something remarkable. The notebook, for instance. Sterling had glimpsed enough of its contents to recognize graduate-level chemistry equations. The handwriting was precise, methodical, the kind that came from rigorous scientific training. And those molecular diagrams weren't copied from textbooks. They showed original analysis and modification. Then there was Jamal's observational technique, the way he'd identified the waiter's stress signals, his systematic approach to chemical analysis. Even his explanation to the police had followed scientific methodology: hypothesis, observation, conclusion. Sterling unconsciously adjusted his MIT class ring, a nervous habit from his college days. Something about Jamal's problem-solving approach felt eerily familiar, like an echo of conversations from long ago. "At least let me buy you dinner," Sterling insisted, "and maybe see a doctor. Make sure you're not hurt from all this excitement." Jamal's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, betraying how long it had been since his last meal. A flush of embarrassment colored his cheeks. "I suppose, if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "After what you've done? It's the least I can offer." As they waited for paramedics to complete a basic medical check, Sterling found himself drawn into conversation with this extraordinary young man. What started as polite small talk quickly revealed depths of knowledge that shouldn't exist in someone Jamal's age, especially someone living on the streets. "Where did you study chemistry?" Sterling asked. "My father taught me. He was a researcher." Jamal's voice caught slightly on the past tense. "What kind of research?" "Pharmaceutical compounds, cancer treatment protocols. He believed medicine should help people, not just make money." Something cold moved through Sterling's chest. The phrasing, the idealism, even the specific focus on cancer research, it all felt like déjà vu. "What was your father's name?" But before Jamal could answer, his wallet fell from his jacket pocket as the paramedic adjusted his position. Sterling instinctively bent to retrieve it, and that's when he saw it. A business card that had slipped out and was now lying face up on the marble floor. Sterling Pharmaceuticals, CEO and Chief Research Officer, Thomas Sterling. Jamal reached for it quickly, but not before Sterling had seen his own name and company logo in the teenager's possession. "Where did you get that?" Sterling asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It fell out of your pocket earlier," Jamal said, handing it back. "I was going to return it, but—" He trailed off, looking suddenly exhausted again. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving behind the reality of cold, hunger, and homelessness that no amount of heroism could erase. Sterling pocketed the card, but his mind was racing. A homeless teenager with advanced chemistry knowledge. A father who'd been a pharmaceutical researcher. Problem-solving techniques that felt like something from his own past. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but Sterling had a feeling that when they did, everything would change. As Sterling watched the teenager disappear into the night, three things bothered him. The police had finished their work. Statements taken, evidence bagged, media interviews given. Thomas Sterling should have felt relieved, grateful even. Instead, he stood in the restaurant's doorway, watching Jamal Washington fade into the rain-soaked darkness, and couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just encountered a ghost. First, there was the chemistry knowledge. Sterling had spent decades around brilliant scientists, and Jamal's understanding wasn't self-taught street wisdom. It was sophisticated, methodical, rooted in advanced theory. The way he'd analyzed the wine's chemical composition, identified the specific compound, even predicted the time frame for toxicity, that level of expertise took years of formal training. But how does a homeless teenager acquire graduate-level chemistry knowledge? Second, the problem-solving approach. Sterling had watched Jamal work through the crisis, and the methodology was hauntingly familiar. Systematic observation, hypothesis formation, risk assessment, decisive action. It reminded him of someone, but the memory stayed frustratingly out of reach, like trying to recall a half-forgotten dream. And third, most disturbing of all, was the timing. Sterling pulled out his phone and scrolled through the evening's threatening messages from Richard Hawthorne. The hostile takeover attempt, the stolen research, the pharmaceutical patents that had mysteriously transferred to competing companies over the past 3 years. All of it connected to the work his research team had been doing before the accident. Before Michael. Sterling stopped walking. Michael. The name Jamal had mentioned when describing his father. Michael, the pharmaceutical researcher who believed medicine should help people, not just make money. Michael, who'd focused on cancer treatment protocols. Sterling's hands were shaking as he speed-dialed his head of security. "Marcus, I need you to run a background check, full investigation. Jamal Washington, approximately 17 years old, homeless, extensive chemistry knowledge." He paused, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, "and cross-reference with any connection to Dr. Michael Washington." The silence on the other end stretched too long. "Sir, did you say Michael Washington?" "You know the name?" "Sir, Dr. Michael Washington was your former research partner. He died 3 years ago in the lab explosion. Don't you remember?" The phone slipped from Sterling's fingers, clattering onto the rain-soaked sidewalk. Memories came flooding back like a dam bursting. Michael Washington, his closest friend, his most trusted collaborator, the brilliant chemist who'd developed the breakthrough cancer treatment that Hawthorne was now trying to steal. Michael, who'd died in a suspicious accident just days before he was scheduled to testify about falsified research data. Michael, who'd had a family, a wife, a son who would now be about 17 years old. Sterling's mind raced through the implications. If Jamal was Michael's son, then he wasn't just some random homeless teenager. He was the heir to one of the most important pharmaceutical breakthroughs of the decade. He was a living witness to his father's work, And if Hawthorne discovered that Michael Washington's son was still alive, Sterling grabbed his phone and called his driver. "Get the car, now. We need to find that boy." But Jamal Washington had already vanished into the city's maze of shadows and secrets, carrying knowledge that could destroy empires or save lives. The real question was, which would it be? The private investigator's report would contain 5 words that changed everything. Subject is Michael Washington's son. Sterling sat in his home office at 3 a.m., rain still drumming against the windows, staring at the manila folder that had arrived by courier 20 minutes ago. His hands trembled as he opened it, though he already knew what he would find inside. But knowing and seeing were 2 different kinds of devastation. The first page contained Jamal's school records. Honor roll every semester until 3 years ago. Advanced placement chemistry, mathematics, physics. Science fair winner. MIT early admission acceptance letter dated 2 months before his life imploded. The second page was harder to read. Medical bills, foreclosure notices, legal documents related to an insurance claim denial. Death certificate for Dr. Michael Washington, age 41, cause of death. Accidental explosion in laboratory. Sterling's vision blurred. Michael, his research partner, his closest friend, the most brilliant chemist he'd ever known, the man who'd called him at midnight with concerns about falsified data in their trials, the man who'd died in a gas leak explosion 3 days before he was scheduled to meet with FDA investigators, the man whose family Sterling had failed to protect. The investigation continued across multiple pages, each one a knife twist of recognition and guilt. Dr. Sarah Washington, Michael's wife, was hospitalized for severe depression and anxiety following her husband's death. Medical bills that consumed their life savings. Their son, Jamal, was forced to drop out of school to care for her. But it was the final section that shattered Sterling's remaining composure. Financial records showing anonymous payments to Riverside Mental Health Facility over the past 3 years. Monthly transfers of exactly $4,847 covering the full cost of Sarah Washington's treatment. The payments traced back to the Sterling Foundation, a charitable organization that Thomas had established to help families of pharmaceutical researchers who died in the line of duty. Sterling had been funding Jamal's mother's care all along, and the boy had no idea. The weight of realization crushed down on him like a collapsing building. 3 years ago, when Michael died, Sterling had made inquiries about the family. He'd been told they'd moved away, that they were being cared for by relatives. He'd arranged the anonymous payments through his foundation and assumed that was enough. He'd never imagined that Michael's son was living on the streets, believing himself abandoned by the world. Sterling's phone buzzed with a text from his head of security. "Found additional information? You need to see this immediately." The second folder arrived within the hour, and its contents were even more explosive. Surveillance footage from the night of Michael's death showed figures entering the laboratory after hours. Corporate emails discussing the problem of Michael's whistleblowing. Financial transfers between Hawthorne Industries and various shell companies. And most damning of all, a recording of Richard Hawthorne discussing the need to permanently silence Michael Washington before he could expose the falsified research data. Michael Washington hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered. The pharmaceutical breakthrough that Hawthorne was now trying to steal through the hostile takeover? It was Michael's work. The patents that had mysteriously transferred to competing companies? They'd been stolen from a dead man who could no longer defend his intellectual property. And Jamal, brilliant, homeless, desperate Jamal, was the only living witness to his father's research. The only person who could testify about the original work, the authentic data, the true nature of the treatment protocols. If Hawthorne discovered that Michael's son was alive and possessed his father's knowledge, Sterling's blood ran cold. Tonight's assassination attempt hadn't been about the hostile takeover. It had been about silencing someone who might eventually connect the dots. Someone who might realize that Michael Washington had been murdered for trying to expose pharmaceutical fraud. But Hawthorne didn't know about Jamal yet. The boy had lived off the grid for 3 years, invisible to corporate investigators. Tonight's heroic act, captured on every security camera and shared across social media, had just made him very visible. The irony was devastating. By saving Sterling's life, Jamal had likely signed his own death warrant. Sterling grabbed his phone and dialed his security chief. "Marcus, I need a protection detail immediately. Find Jamal Washington and bring him somewhere safe. Full surveillance countermeasures." "And Marcus?" His voice turned to steel. "If Hawthorne's people get to that boy before we do, I'll hold you personally responsible." But even as he spoke, Sterling knew they might already be too late. The news coverage was spreading. Social media was buzzing with the story of the homeless teenager who'd saved a billionaire's life. Hawthorne would see it, would make the connection, and would realize that his greatest threat wasn't a corporate rival. It was a 17-year-old boy with his father's knowledge and his father's integrity. The most gut-wrenching part was the missed opportunities. 3 years of Sterling believing Michael's family was safe and cared for. 3 years of Jamal struggling alone, thinking the world had forgotten his father's sacrifice. 3 years of a brilliant mind being wasted on the streets while the criminals who'd destroyed his life profited from stolen research. Sterling thought about the notebook Jamal had carried. Weathered, protected, treasured. How much of Michael's original work was in those pages? How much crucial evidence had been preserved by a homeless teenager who refused to give up on his father's legacy? The boy who'd saved his life tonight wasn't just a hero. He was the key to everything. The missing piece that could expose the corruption, restore justice, and honor Michael Washington's memory. And now Sterling had one chance to save him, just as Jamal had saved Sterling. But first, he had to find him. And pray that Hawthorne's assassins weren't already hunting through the city's shadows, looking for a homeless teenager who knew too much. The race against time had begun, and everything depended on reaching Jamal Washington before the killers did. Sterling's offer would sound impossible, but Jamal's response would be even more surprising. Dawn was breaking over the city when Sterling's security team finally located Jamal. He was exactly where a trained investigator would never think to look, sitting in the public library, which opened at 6 a.m. for early commuters. While assassins searched abandoned buildings and homeless encampments, Jamal was reading chemistry journals and working on scholarship applications by fluorescent light. Sterling found him in the science section, surrounded by textbooks he'd pulled from the shelves. Even exhausted and still wearing yesterday's rain-soaked clothes, Jamal had arranged his study space with scientific precision. Notes organized by topic, reference materials stacked by priority. His father's methodology lived on in every detail. "Jamal." Sterling's voice was soft, careful not to startle him. "We need to talk." The teenager looked up, and Sterling saw the exact moment when recognition dawned in those intelligent eyes. Not just recognition of Sterling the man, but understanding of what his presence meant. No one found homeless people at dawn unless something was desperately wrong. "You're in danger," Sterling said without preamble. "The man who tried to kill me last night, he's going to come after you next." Jamal closed the textbook slowly, processing this information with the same systematic approach he brought to chemistry problems. "Because of what I witnessed?" "Because of who you are." Sterling sat down across from him, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Your father was Dr. Michael Washington, my research partner, my closest friend. And he didn't die in an accident." The words hit Jamal like a physical blow. Sterling watched the teenager's face cycle through emotions, shock, hope, anger, grief, before settling into something harder, something that looked disturbingly like adult resolve. "You knew my father?" "I knew him. I worked with him. I failed to protect him." Sterling's voice cracked. "And I failed to protect you." For the next 20 minutes, Sterling laid out everything. The falsified research data, Michael's planned testimony, the suspicious explosion, the stolen patents, the 3 years of anonymous payments Sterling had been making for Sarah's medical care, never knowing her son was living on the streets. "I've been funding your mother's treatment this whole time," Sterling finished. She's safe, Jamal. She's getting the best care available, but you... God, I thought you were with family. I thought you were safe. Jamal's hands shook as he absorbed this revelation. My mother is... She's really okay? More than okay. She's been asking for you. The doctors say she's ready for supervised visits. That broke something loose in Jamal's chest. 3 years of carrying the weight alone, believing his mother was lost to him forever, thinking he'd failed to save his family the way he'd failed to save his father. Tears he'd been holding back since the night of the explosion finally came. But Sterling wasn't finished. Jamal, I want to offer you something. Full scholarship to MIT, not just tuition, but housing, living expenses, everything. A research position at Sterling Pharmaceuticals working on your father's breakthrough cancer treatment. Your mother transferred to the best private facility in the country with full medical coverage for life. He paused, watching Jamal's eyes widen. But there's more. I want you to be my partner in finishing what your father started. The research that Hawthorne killed him for? It's still viable, still revolutionary, still capable of saving millions of lives. Your father's life's work doesn't have to die with him. Jamal stared at Sterling for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. Why me? You don't even know me. I know enough. Sterling leaned forward. You saved my life last night with knowledge your father taught you. You refused payment when you desperately needed it. You've survived 3 years on the streets without losing your integrity or your brilliance. And you carry your father's notebook like it's sacred, because to you, it is. Sterling pulled out his phone and showed Jamal a photo. 3 people in lab coats, arms around each other, smiling at the camera. Michael Washington, Sarah Washington, and Thomas Sterling, taken 5 years ago at the pharmaceutical conference where they'd announced their partnership. Your father was the best man I've ever known, Sterling said quietly. He believed science should serve humanity, not profit margins. He died protecting that principle. And you've been living that principle every day without even knowing it. Jamal studied the photograph, seeing his father young and hopeful and alive. He never told me about you. He was protecting you. He knew the research was dangerous, that powerful people would kill to control it. He kept his work life separate from his family to keep you safe. Sterling's voice hardened. It didn't work. What happens if I say yes? You become the target instead of the victim. Hawthorne will try to kill you, but this time you'll have resources to fight back. FBI protection, corporate lawyers, and me doing what I should have done 3 years ago, standing up for what's right. Jamal was quiet for so long that Sterling began to worry he'd overwhelmed the teenager. But when Jamal finally spoke, his voice carried his father's determination. The cancer treatment, if we complete it, how many lives could it save? Conservative estimate? Hundreds of thousands in the first decade alone. And my mother would really be okay? I promise you, the best care money can buy. Jamal closed his eyes, and Sterling could practically see him weighing the decision. Safety versus purpose, anonymity versus justice, the easy path versus the right path. When Jamal opened his eyes, Sterling saw Michael Washington looking back at him. My father always said that with knowledge comes responsibility, Jamal said quietly. I guess it's time I lived up to that. So you'll do it? I'll do it. But not for the money or the scholarship. Jamal's voice grew stronger. I'll do it because the world deserves to know what my father died trying to give them. Sterling felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time in 3 years. Michael's son was going to finish Michael's work, and together they were going to make the bastards pay. 6 months later, the ripple effects were beyond anything either imagined. The transformation began with a single photograph that went viral worldwide. Jamal Washington, 17 years old, standing next to his mother Sarah at MIT's graduation ceremony. Not his own graduation, that was still 3 years away, but rather a special ceremony honoring the late Dr. Michael Washington with a posthumous degree in humanitarian science. Jamal wore his father's lab coat, carefully preserved and now tailored to fit his growing frame. Sarah, healthy and radiant after months of proper treatment, pinned a MIT research badge to his chest, the same badge his father had worn during their groundbreaking partnership. But the real story was happening in laboratories around the world. The Sterling Washington Research Foundation had been established with a single mission: complete Michael Washington's cancer treatment and ensure it reached patients who needed it most, regardless of their ability to pay. The Foundation's headquarters occupied an entire floor of Sterling Pharmaceuticals, with Jamal's workstation positioned exactly where his father's had been. The FBI's investigation into Richard Hawthorne's pharmaceutical conspiracy had exploded into the biggest corporate fraud case in decades. Hawthorne Industries collapsed within weeks of the indictments. 17 executives faced federal charges. The stolen research patents were returned to their rightful owners, the Washington family estate, now administered jointly by Sarah and Jamal. But the most remarkable development was the treatment itself. Phase 3 trials show a 91% response rate, Dr. Sarah Washington announced at the International Cancer Research Conference, her first public appearance since her recovery. My husband's protocol, refined by our son's innovations, represents the most significant breakthrough in cancer treatment since chemotherapy. The audience erupted in applause, but the real victory was quieter, more personal. In research hospitals across the country, patients who'd been given months to live were walking out healthy. Children returned to playgrounds. Parents lived to see their kids graduate. Grandparents held newborn grandchildren they'd never expected to meet. The Washington treatment, as it became known, was manufactured at cost and distributed through a global network of humanitarian partnerships. No patient was turned away for inability to pay. Pharmaceutical companies that had profited from inferior treatments suddenly found themselves competing with a therapy designed to heal rather than generate revenue. Media coverage of the story sparked a broader conversation about corporate responsibility in medical research. 60 Minutes featured a special investigation into pharmaceutical fraud. Medical journals published retrospective analyses of other suspicious accidents that had eliminated inconvenient researchers. Congress launched hearings into FDA oversight of clinical trials. The scholarship program Sterling and Jamal created exceeded all expectations. The Michael Washington Memorial Scholarship specifically targeted homeless youth with scientific aptitude, providing not just education funding but comprehensive support services, housing, healthcare, mentoring, and most importantly, the message that circumstances don't define potential. We've identified 47 homeless teenagers with exceptional scientific knowledge, reported Dr. Jennifer Kim, the program's director and the same professor who'd once complimented Jamal's water quality analysis. These kids have been surviving on the streets while mastering complex chemistry, physics, and biology. Imagine what they could accomplish with proper resources. One recipient, 16-year-old Marcus Carter, had been living in abandoned subway tunnels while building functional electronics from discarded components. Another, 18-year-old Sofia Rodriguez, had developed her own system for purifying contaminated water using materials scavenged from construction sites. The mobile chemistry labs that Jamal designed brought scientific education directly to underserved communities. Bright yellow vans equipped with portable equipment visited homeless camps, low-income neighborhoods, and rural areas where traditional educational resources were scarce. Children who'd never seen a microscope were suddenly conducting their own experiments, discovering that science wasn't something that happened in distant laboratories, but rather a tool for understanding and improving their immediate world. Corporate whistleblower protections were strengthened in direct response to Michael Washington's murder. The Washington Act provided federal protection and financial support for researchers who exposed fraudulent data or unsafe practices in pharmaceutical development. No scientist would again face the choice between their conscience and their life. Most powerfully, the story inspired countless acts of everyday heroism. Social media filled with videos of people helping strangers, using their knowledge and skills to solve problems in their communities. Washington Challenge became a global movement, encouraging individuals to apply their expertise in service of others, no matter how small their contribution might seem. The documentary, The Notebook, A Father's Legacy, won 3 Emmy Awards and sparked international conversations about intellectual property rights, pharmaceutical ethics, and the power of inherited knowledge. Schools across the country added Michael Washington's story to their science curricula, teaching students that the greatest discoveries come not from seeking profit, but from seeking truth. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation was invisible to cameras and media coverage. In homeless shelters and community centers, in libraries and laboratories, young people who'd been written off by society found hope in Jamal's story. If a homeless teenager could save a billionaire's life and change the world, what might they accomplish? The ripple effects continued expanding, touching lives in ways that would never be fully measured or documented. One act of courage, one moment of choosing to help rather than hide, had become a movement that redefined what was possible when knowledge met compassion. And it all started with a boy who refused to let his father's death be meaningless. But the most important moment wasn't captured by any camera. 2 years later, Jamal Washington was no longer the homeless teenager who'd burst into an upscale restaurant screaming about poison. At 19, he was MIT's youngest junior researcher, holder of 3 patents in pharmaceutical chemistry, and co-director of the Sterling Washington Research Foundation. His mother, Sarah, had returned to active research, leading a team developing treatments for rare diseases. The family that had been shattered by tragedy was not just rebuilt, it was stronger. But some things never change. That Tuesday morning, Jamal was reviewing grant applications in MIT's student cafe when he noticed something wrong. A nervous-looking man in a maintenance uniform was approaching a table where Emma Carter, a freshman chemistry student, sat absorbed in her textbook. The man's hands shook as he set down a coffee cup that clearly hadn't come from the cafe's kitchen, wrong brand, different temperature, and positioned too deliberately next to Emma's drink. Jamal's training kicked in instantly. The maintenance worker's behavior, the mismatched coffee, the way the man kept glancing toward the exit, and underneath it all, a faint but unmistakable scent that made his blood run cold. Bitter almonds. Without hesitation, Jamal stood up and called across the cafe. "Emma, stop! Don't drink that!" The maintenance worker bolted for the door, but campus security was faster this time. The coffee cup tested positive for the same compound that had nearly killed Thomas Sterling 2 years earlier. The would-be assassin confessed to being hired by remaining members of Hawthorne's criminal network, desperate to eliminate the next generation of Washington family researchers. But this time, the story didn't end with chaos and confusion. Emma Carter turned out to be the daughter of Dr. Jennifer Kim, the scholarship program director. She was brilliant, ambitious, and reminded Jamal powerfully of himself at that age, someone with the potential to change the world if given the chance. "How did you know?" Emma asked later, as police finished their investigation. Jamal smiled, thinking of his father's voice echoing across the years. "Someone very wise once taught me that with knowledge comes responsibility. When you can help someone, you help them. Period." That afternoon, Sterling visited the campus and found Jamal in the new Michael Washington Memorial Laboratory. The space was everything his father would have wanted: cutting-edge equipment, collaborative workspace, and a mission statement engraved in brass by the entrance. "Knowledge is power, but wisdom is knowing when to act." "Still saving lives, I see," Sterling said, settling into a familiar chair by Jamal's workstation. "Just following the example I was given." Jamal gestured to a framed photograph on his desk, the same picture of his parents and Sterling from 5 years ago, now accompanied by a newer photo of Jamal receiving his first research award. "Your father would be proud," Sterling said quietly. "I think he'd be proud of what comes next," Jamal replied, pointing to the stack of scholarship applications on his desk. 47 new students this year. Kids who've been overlooked, underestimated, forgotten by the system. Each one carries knowledge that could change everything. Sterling nodded, remembering another overlooked teenager who'd changed his life forever. Any homeless chemistry prodigies in the bunch? 3, actually, including a 15-year-old who's been developing water purification systems while living in abandoned buildings. Jamal's eyes lit up with the same passion his father had shown. Imagine what she could do with proper resources. As evening fell over the campus, both men understood that the work would never be finished. There would always be another person in need, another life to save, another opportunity to choose courage over comfort. But that's exactly how it should be. Because sometimes the most ordinary moment, a homeless teenager noticing something wrong, can spark extraordinary change. And somewhere in the city, another young scientist was probably developing the knowledge that would save tomorrow's world. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the most important message. Think about it. How many Jamals are walking through your community right now? How many brilliant minds are hidden behind circumstances that society has taught us to ignore? How many potential world changers are one act of kindness away from discovering their true purpose? Jamal Washington's story started with tragedy, but it transformed into hope, because someone chose to listen when a homeless teenager said stop. Because knowledge met courage at exactly the right moment. Because a father's legacy lived on through a son who refused to give up. But here's the truth that matters most. You don't need a chemistry degree to change someone's life. You don't need wealth or power or recognition. You just need to pay attention, to act when you see something wrong, to believe that wisdom can come from the most unexpected places. So tell me, when was the last time you really listened to someone the world had written off? Share your story in the comments below. And if this reminded you that every voice matters, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that prove ordinary people can create extraordinary change. Subscribe to Black Voices Uncut for more stories that prove kindness is the most powerful force in the world. Because you never know. The stranger you help today might just be the key to your tomorrow. Because somewhere out there, the next Jamal Washington is waiting for someone to believe in them. Will it be you?